It is recording right now, so we're ready to go.
Awesome. So again, thank you. My name is Lindsay Grimm. I'm the Morrow County Recycling Director, Keep Morrow County Beautiful. And we were able to receive a grant to help sponsor this workshop. So those that are attending 2 workshops out of the 5 will be entered into a drawing to receive one of 3 types of compost bins. We actually have 9 to give away. And so it's exciting to do that. And then working and partnering with Carrie Jagger Murphy to also help with the educational piece and offering the compost workshops. So with that, recycling is huge and compost is even larger of a portion of what goes to the landfill. And so this was a great way to start getting that education out. And that's a little bit about us, and Carrie will continue.
All right. So let me move some stuff here on my screen so I can see my notes. So vermicomposting is similar to traditional composting. Both use natural processes to stabilize organic matter. Traditional composting relies on fungi and microorganisms to stabilize the organic matter. Therefore, it's sometimes called microbial composting. Worms do most of the composting in vermicomposting. Both microbial and worm composting are aerobic processes, which means they require oxygen to function. One advantage of vermicomposting is you do not need to aerate or turn the vermicompost pile because the worms do that for you. Excess energy is given off as heat in microbial composting, and in vermicomposting, most of this energy is tied up in the worm biomass. In fact, the last thing you want is a vermicompost pile to heat up because worms don't like that heat. If they can escape it, they will, and if they cannot, they will eventually die from that. Lindsay, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, if they're escaping, then we have something that's off balance. So, and
that's right.
Is definitely one of those things to look for.
All right. So you don't want to confuse vermicomposting with vermiculture. And you, well, what's the difference? And we're going to talk about that. Vermiculture is raising earthworms for bait, and vermicomposting is using worms to actually make that compost. You can use worms from vermicomposting for bait, but is not recommended because they're much smaller, and some of those species can be invasive, and we're going to touch on that a little bit more as we go along through our presentation. There are 9,000 species of earthworms, and they range from 1/2 inch to 22 feet long. Only 7 have been identified as suitable for composting, composting worms, and composting bins. Earthworm fetida is used by most people throughout the world. This is the most common one that you would use in your compost bin. Is commonly called the red wiggler in addition to several other names. So it's also can be called the tiger worm or the red tiger worm. The tiger name comes from a distinctive dark and light color banding that is unique to the Earthworm fetida. And if you look here, it's dark and then it's got the light color. Can you see my pointer, Lindsay?
Yes.
Okay, it's got the dark and the light color band, which kind of makes it look like a tiger. So that's where it gets that name of tiger worm, common name. These worms feed in the top layers of the soil, which makes them great composters of organic matter. Lindsay, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, I was actually trying to work on the chat piece, sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. If you want to monitor the chats, that'd be great.
We have somebody that wasn't able to hear us via the phone call-in.
I'm not sure I'm not sure how to fix that. I apologize. So when you're buying worms, and we'll get into buying them in a little bit, you want a scientific name. as a few other worm species are also called red wigglers. If you go to the bait store and you say you want red wigglers, you may not be getting the Acinia fetida. You may be getting Lumbricus rubellus, which is a red earthworm, and this worm is native to Europe, and it was brought here with settlers. So we do have this worm here also. And then there's the Amnithus genus. Those are called jumping worms, and these are native to Asia. The Lumbricus rubellus redworm is native to Europe, like I said. It was brought here many years ago with the settlers. This is the worm we usually see and welcome in our gardens and fields. However, this worm, when introduced to forested areas, can be very detrimental to the ecosystem of the forest. Over time, the forest ecosystem has evolved to take care of itself, and if the Lumbricus rubellus is introduced, it could upset that ecosystem of the forest and make it easier for invasive species plants to take over. A worm is capable of consuming up to its own weight in food every day. As such, 1 kilogram of worms will consume between 500 grams and 1 kilogram of food material every day. Therefore, when you purchase worms for fishing, you want to make sure that you don't dump them out by the lake or the pond or near a forest when you get done, because you never know what species they might be, and you don't want to be that person that introduces the invasive species to the forest. These two worm species that I mentioned, the Lumbricus rubellus and the Amnithus genus of worms, they also live in the top layers of the soil and are used for composting, but they're not as common in vermicomposting as the Acinia fetida.
And if you don't know those real names or those types of things, don't worry about it. But the key part is to take home is that, you know, when we were taught little that we can just throw the rest of our worms in the pond or river or wherever, and it would be okay. The key point here is that a worm can definitely eat its weight, and it can do damage, especially. And the bait stores have probably no idea what kind of worms that they're selling. It's just an earthworm, in quotes. And so just make sure that you're not letting them go.
Okay. Lindsay, we're going to move into the biology, and I know you like talking about the worm parts. Do you want to cover this piece?
I love this piece because when I talk to the kids, this is the most exciting piece for the kids to start exploring, because one of the biggest things that they ask is, so is my worm a girl or a boy? And the question, it's a trick question because they are
hermaphrodites.
There you go. Glad that you can pull that name off. So that means that each worm actually has both female and male parts. They mate by joining their syllotae, which is the band part that you can see on a worm, and they exchange sperm over top of that when they rub that cilium piece together. And then each worm forms an egg capsule in about 7 to 10 days. And then it sheds it off as a casting, and the egg copulates into a lemon-shaped form, which is about the size of a match head. And they're like little clear to white-colored lemon-shaped pieces, which is the little baby worms. And about after 14 to 21 days, the baby worms hatch from the eggs. And there are 1 to 5 worms that hatch, and it takes about 60 to 90 days for the young worms to mature. And this again is under favorable conditions, but you can see there they look like kind of tapioca size pieces, and those are the worm cocoons, and that is where our little baby worms come. And so that's kind of fun. The average worm can actually form 4 to 5 of those cocoons per month. So you can tell that in perfect conditions that your worms are reproducing at a pretty fast rate. And another fun fact about worms, if you want to go back one, is that, go back one more, is that worms actually have 5 hearts. And so this is always a fun trivia piece. And worms can live as long for many, many years. And sometimes like, 4 to 5 years, but that's a really long time for a worm. And you think about what they're doing and how much they're processing and eating every day. That can be a really long time. Worms die in the bin, their bodies decompose and are recycled. So it's that circle of life. They're always, just eating and eating and eating and eating, and then eventually they'll die and decompose. And the worm composting, if it gets overly abundant of the castings, it's actually pretty toxic. So we'll talk about how to manage that when we're harvesting our compost. And that is a little bit about that piece. But the next question that the kids love to ask is, so if I pull it in half, will it stay alive? And the contrary to popular belief is that worms can reproduce a tail, but it depends on how far that worm was cut. So it can reproduce a small portion, but if it's vital organs or portions of the worm is actually cut, it will die. Now, the crazy piece is that it will start with both ends will wiggle and wiggle and wiggle and wiggle, and until, because they have this nervous system that goes through there that is just unbelievable. But yeah, the tail end won't produce a head, and if it's too far above the tail, it won't generate a new tail and it dies. So those are the fun, quick facts that all of the little guys and gals that I teach when I do vermicomposting with them ask. In addition to making soil, worms are natural soil tillers. They mix the layers of soil while producing tunnels, and that's where you get your earthworms. And so earthworms are a little different than our composters, as she said, but earthworms really like to dwell really deep into the water or into the ground. So their natural environment is between 10 and 12 feet below the surface of the earth. And so when it rains, you'll see lots and lots of earthworms at the surface on our sidewalks and those things to drying out. So they do need some moisture, but they can't live in a swimming pool. And so that's the same with our composting worms. If they do need some moisture, so your bin needs to be a little bit wet. But if it's excessively wet, then they can't breathe because they exchange that oxygen through their skin. And so that's a big piece to think about. And then when they eat the food, they digest it through a, what is that called?
Their gizzard.
The gizzard, the same thing that chickens have, a gizzard. I lost my part in my notes, so I'm just doing this by like my normal spiel with the kiddos. So they have a gizzard that they process and kind of chew up and grind all of that food compost, and so it just grinds it up just as a chicken would. And so that's kind of how they do that. And then the compost piece is actually worm poop. And so you tell that to the kids and they go, we're touching poop. And of course, but that poop is extremely valuable to us. And that is why we call it that black gold, because it's compost. It is very valuable because it's high in nutrients. It's a great soil additive. Adding it to your plants, your vegetables that you'll be planting here soon and trying to pot up is huge. The other piece that we get off from our worm bins is, or another that they secrete, is like the liquid piece, and that is compost tea. And so that is just the compost that's breaking down in extra water secretions. And so that compost tea is a natural fertilizer as well. So there's a lot about the whole body structure, and the parts and the muscles are moving and contracting to help break down all this food matter even finer and making it really work to our advantage. So they're mighty machines that are very little, but they are very, very powerful.
All right. We're going to move on to bin location. Lindsay and I both get a lot of questions about where can I put my bin? And for a number of years, I've been here at the extension office for 5 years. And a couple years ago, I had a worm bin going. And then I fed it too much and it got gross. And we're going to talk about that as we go on. But I still have it under my desk. And we're going to get some more worms going in it here before long. So you can put your worm bin anywhere as long as air can circulate around it and it isn't in direct sunlight. And the internal temperature is between 59 and 77 degrees. And you can get a thermometer. They make soil thermometers. They make compost thermometers like here in this picture. And you can insert that in your bin and it'll let you know what the internal temperature is. Your earthworms can survive at 32 to 95 degrees with optimum temperature maintained as close to 70 degrees Fahrenheit as possible. To do this, you need to make sure to have at least 4 inches of bedding, and you can insulate the bin during colder months. You should insulate the bin during colder months if it's outside or in a garage or somewhere that you can't maintain that 70-degree temperature. And you can use blankets or straw or blue insulation board or other materials to keep it warm. As temperatures go farther below or above these limits, the worms will decrease the amount they eat and breed. Moisture limits are 60 to 85%, with 80% being optimum. Like Lindsay said, they don't like it real wet, but they like it moist. Oxygen, like we mentioned earlier, is very necessary to make sure your worm bin has holes in it. And we'll talk about that as we talk about the different types of worm bins that you can use. But you definitely want holes in the worm bin to allow for airflow. And then try to maintain a pH of 0.7 in the bin. That's a neutral pH. They don't want it real acidic. And we'll discuss that as we move along in what to feed them. So there's different types of vermicompost bins. I'm going to let Lindsay talk about this because she's got some pictures. Some pictures here on the slideshow. This one up here on the left is kind of a traditional bin that you could buy from a store. This one over here on the right is a wooden bin that you could build. I built one of these a few years back and I had it in my basement and I had screen mesh on the bottom of it. And if you use screen or any kind of mesh in your bins to plug the holes so the worms don't escape, you want to make sure that you don't use anything that's metallic. The worms don't like metallic substances. This is just a traditional type bin. Lindsay has a bin very much like this one. And then this is one where they've drilled holes and they'll stack it inside of this one. You want to go ahead, Lindsay, and show your bins?
Maybe.
Can you share, if I stop screen share, could you share your screen and maybe be able to show the bins easier?
I don't know if it's
it might be because
too close. There we go. Haha. So this one, can you see me?
Yep, I can see you.
All right. So this one is like the regular traditional square type bin. And so this is again a homemade little jobby. This is the one I actually take out to the kids. And so I do have one that has holes in the bottom, but since this is the one I transport around everywhere, I just have holes on the side of the bin. Lots and lots of holes, and then it's always in an open space so that the air can circulate all the way around it, because I don't have that drainage and I don't have the extra holes that I would put into a bin of this kind to make sure that it has enough air and oxygen movement. The oxygen and air movement is huge. As it starts to decompose, or it helps aid in that natural process of decomposing the organic matter. So if you block out the oxygen, then you're going to start getting lots and lots of smells. It is also going to sit in there and it's going to create some more challenges for you. I do have a bin that actually my neighbor made, and it simulates the worm hotel bin. But again, it is a bin that, I don't know why I keep popping in and out of my screen.
It's because I had you put that backdrop on.
Oh, it's all right. So anyways, there we go. So it's another stackable kind of bin. She made it as a stackable. It does have a drain port. If I can find the sweet spot in my video. I don't know, maybe. Probably should take off that backdrop somehow. I just don't know how.
Go down to your camera. And the bottom where it says the video.
Oh, yeah.
Click on the little down arrow.
Setting, and then
choose your virtual background and then take it away. Sorry, folks.
There we go. Figured it out. Ha, suckers. I win. So anyways, so it's a regular bin. It has a spout to collect that compost tea. It is also a stackable piece, so that she added the air holes on the top part, and then she'll be able to add the stackable piece, and then she drilled tons and tons and tons of holes in the bottom so that they can go up and down vertically as well.
Are there worms in that bin right now, Lindsay?
Yes. She started hers last week, so it's a brand new start. So we can talk about that when we start. Get into there. And then this is the worm hotel is what I call it. And so it's that stackable piece. We started this, last spring. I have 3 bins, so I feed them I try to keep them all going. But the cool thing about these bins is that, I don't know, you can see that the worms can go up and down through all of the holes. So this is
kind of hard. Hey, Lindsay, it's kind of hard to see those holes. Can you hold it? There you go, right there. Excellent.
So it's a plastic mesh already built, and then the worms travel up and down through all of those holes. And so this is for those individuals, you want a stacking one for those individuals who do not like to touch the worms. Because at some point of time, you're going to have to get into your bin, to harvest the material and at least, touch those worms in that aspect. But the stackable bins is a way that you can kind of compost without having to touch those worms, because you start with your bottom one and you get them started, and then you start adding the trays or the next bin on top. And then you'll start feeding on top, and then they'll go up to feed. And then the next one will be just their castings or the compost piece. And then they'll separate themselves out through the system. So that is a fun type of bin. I call it the worm hotel because literally it grows up and down, and then they use those mesh pieces to take the elevator up and down, and that's how you can think about the stackable ones. Now with your square one, making a mess. With the square bin, you're actually going to, so you're going to start feeding in one spot, and then you're going to feed in the next spot, and then the following spot, and you're just going to make a kind of a pattern around the whole entire bin, and that's going to really make a difference. And then once you get in there, you have to actually move it and work with finding the worms and kind of keeping them moving around the bin. So each bin has its pros and each bin has its cons.
This bin that Lindsay's showing right here is actually a really fun bin when you're working with kids. My bin in my basement was like that, and my bin in my office was similar to that. I tried to make it so they could climb up and down, but they didn't really move up and down. In mine, it was a homemade bin, and I don't know that the holes were big enough. but we took them and used them with kids, and they love to dig in this. So if you have children or grandchildren, this is a fun one to do. And you can actually find the eggs in it as well and the little baby worms. So it's a really good educational piece for the little kids. Lindsay, we got a couple questions.
Perfect.
Let's see. One is, what do you recommend for bedding and what should we avoid? We're going to talk about that as we go on, so we're not going to answer that one right yet. How large to make the holes? I say just slightly bigger than the worms, because they can squeeze down to fit through tiny holes. Wouldn't you agree, Lindsay?
I agree. You don't want them to you don't want them to be clogged. So the bigger the hole, the more opportunity for it to become, a challenge, because then you're going to have a lot of things, but they can't be too small as well. I'll have to measure what that mesh is, and maybe try to get that out somehow.
Okay. All right, we're ready to move on. Lindsay, you got anything more for that?
Nope, that's it.
All right, we're going to talk about filling the bin next, and these are some of the topics that we're going to cover while we discuss filling it. Sourcing our worms, how many worms, what do they eat, adding food, and finally harvesting the worms. So we'll start here with sourcing the worms. There's worm farms on the internet, or you may have friends who already have worm bins. I know some of my master gardeners have worm bins. Lindsay's got worm bins. So if you know friends who already have worm bins, you can feel free to share your worms, because they do multiply rapidly. Or you can order them from different worm farms on the internet. You got any input on sourcing worms, Lindsay?
Those are really the two easiest ways. Internet, just again, making sure that you're ordering the correct red wiggler worms, and then finding worms from your friends. And honestly, as we'll learn a little bit later, make sure that you are finding true red wiggler worms. So one of the bins I got from a lady that said that she just got them from the bait store, and they were red wigglers, but yet I have the most challenges from that bin. My other two bins are legit worms that we got, and I have less problems. So I don't know if that's just a coincidence, but it really does make an impact down the road.
Lindsay, I have used in my bins in the past. I've gone to the bait store and got red wigglers, and I can agree with you. They broke it down, but they didn't break it down fast. Not as fast as your Acinia fetida worms break it down. So I wouldn't go to the bait store and get worms either. It was when I first was starting out and first learning many years ago. And I thought, well, I'll give these a try. And they broke it down, but they didn't break it down real fast. So how many worms do you need? There's about 1,000 worms in a pound, and you want about 1,000 worms to break down your compost quickly. They cost between $20 and $50, just depending on where you get those from. Next, what do they eat? And this is probably one of the most important things, next to finding a good bin and finding a good spot for your bin, is what to feed them. They'll eat fruit and vegetable scraps. They eat coffee grounds and filters. They'll eat tea and tea bags, but you want to remove any metal off of that tea bag. Sometimes they have little staples on them. Eggshells, but you want to make sure you wash out the protein real well out of that eggshell. Paper and cardboard, bread, leaves, and finally you want to chop these up pretty well, a nice fine material. This helps the worms have an easier time eating it because they don't have teeth. So they rely on some of the microorganisms breaking it down, and then they gum it down. So imagine eating all of these things without any teeth. It would be kind of hard. Did you have a comment, Lindsay?
Yeah, just make sure that it's the paper filter and not like the plastic filter. for your coffee.
Right.
The other thing is you can think about how long does it take you to eat a whole apple versus the chopped up apple. So you're already breaking half of that workload up when you chop those types of food items into the bin. The other piece to keep in mind is that what we learned in the last time, which is our browns and our greens. So looking at your browns and greens, making sure that you find that compost or that balance of green and which is your carbons and nitrogens. And so there's a happy balance with that as well. You feed one too much, you're going to get a wet soupy mix. You feed the other one too much, then you're going to get this really kind of dried out piece. So it's really finding that happy balance.
The next slide is what don't they eat? And this is really, really important, because if you feed them things that they shouldn't eat or that they don't like, then you may not have them. So meats of any kind, dairy products, fats or oily foods. They don't like citrus or any kind of acidic foods, onions or garlic, bones, salty foods, and don't use glossy paper or magazines. Those aren't good sources of material. And then don't put any non-biodegradables, plastic, rubber, glasses, etc. I was reading some stuff as we were putting this together, and one comment was that worms are, you can look at or think about worms as being vegans because they don't eat any of the same things that vegans don't eat. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about feeding your worms, that they have a vegan type diet.
Very true. The other thing I want to caution you is that when you're getting a bin started, which, you know, we're talking about bedding, but to try to avoid using heavy inked newspaper as well. The ink, most of the ink in today's world is a bio-based ink, but for some reason it also plays with their chemistry and they don't particularly survive well off of that either.
All right, the next slide, we're going to talk about adding food and bedding. So you'll start with a layer of shredded paper and then add chopped food scraps and worms, and then finish with another layer of paper. The paper should be moistened before you add it to the bin, especially if it's a new startup bin. And the paper can also be added dry if the bin becomes too wet during the process. 1 pound of red wigglers, we mentioned, that's about 1,000 worms. They'll eat up to 2 pounds of food scraps a week. If you add more food than the earthworms can consume, it will start to rot and it will start to become smelly. Sometimes you'll get fruit flies and other flies in there. Ideally, do not add more food until the worms have consumed what you fed them before. And if you produce more food scraps than your bin can handle, buy more earthworms or start a composting bin outside. They're just a normal composting bin. The worms may be fed any time of the day. Don't worry if you go on vacation. The worms can be fed as seldom as every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how many earthworms are in the bin. And if you're going away for a couple of weeks, apply a 1/2 inch layer of food scraps and cover it with 2 inches of moistened shredded paper. And that should take care of your worms while you're away from them. Do you have anything to add to that, Lindsay?
The takeaway home message here is to make sure that you bury your food. Yes, your hand is going to get dirty, but it will wash. The burying of the food is extremely important. You will be thanking me a whole heck of a lot later. You're going to reduce your smells. You're going to reduce your chance of fruit flies. You're going to reduce your chance of other problems. And so just make sure that if you don't learn anything from this webinar, other than the fact to make sure you bury your food and making sure that you cover it so that you cannot see the food after you put it in your bin.
And you don't necessarily need to dig a hole and bury it in the bin, right, no. Lindsay? You can make sure that you're just covering it with shredded cardboard or shredded paper just to keep it covered up. Some of the challenges, we're going to go through these. It can be too wet. It could become smelly, a low reproduction rate in the worms, escaping worms, and some of the pests. Lindsay, you want to go, you want to cover these challenges?
So, my bin, again, it all has something to do kind of with how much, bedding you have and your food and where you have it located at, the temperature. So a lot of these things, it's like this, finding this teeter-totter. When one thing is out of balance, then it's a kind of this chain reaction. It kind of affects the other things. And so my bins are actually in my house, in my laundry room, right off the side of my kitchen. And nobody has a clue that they're there until my 5-year-old goes, "Hey, you want to see my worms?" And he loves his worms. He was so excited that they were going to be movie stars tonight. And we've addressed some of these challenges. He knows when it starts to getting wet that we need to add some browns. So he's already learned that we either need to add some paper, shredded paper, or we need to go find some leaves or sawdust or some of those things. That browns actually helps absorb the moisture. And so then we add that for a little bit, and we don't add any food because your food adds that liquid. Most of our fruits and veggies are chock full of water. So 90 to 95% full of water. And so that's adding to our problem. So we want to make sure that we're adding those browns to help absorb some of that moisture. The other thing that he always likes to do is we have lots of like a basin suck up things, and he pulls off the compost tea from our flat bins. We drain it out of the Worm Hotel compost bin, and he loves to add that to our plants. So if it wasn't for my little guy who's 5 and totally understands worm composting, I would not have very green plants because my thumb is not green. But thankfully, I have worms that have helped make them survive. And so the tricks to wet a bin is definitely adding some browns, which is either newspaper, shredded paper, newspaper. It can even be paper towels and napkins, and or also pulling off that excess water or that compost tea and using it as an effective liquid fertilizer.
Hey, Lindsay, I got a couple things here. Someone asked, I read that peat moss was good, but my worms didn't like it at all. Do you have any comments on peat moss?
I've never added it. The bins and a lot of those other things have come with coconut fibers. It's a good fiber to at least start a bin. I don't think I would try the peat moss, but I don't see why it wouldn't work. The challenge is that when you get peat moss from like a hanging basket or from a wherever, you really don't know much about that and the makeup of that peat moss. So that could have played a factor in what it was, where it came from, if they like it or not, as well.
A lot of times you can just buy plain peat moss at the big box stores. As far as I know, like Lindsay said, if there aren't any amendments in it, it should be okay. Maybe it was too dry for them. Maybe they didn't like the texture of it.
Another piece is that, so the trick is just like any, I don't know, you want to call them pets or whatever, but the more that you pay attention to your worms, the more that you're going to know what they like. So one of my bins really loves watermelon. Another bin likes strawberries, but they all have their own kind of flavor or preferred food. And so you can really tell, and then another one really likes apples. And I don't know if that's just because that's what they get the most of, because that's what my kids like, and they're all about feeding the worms, but they really do have things that they really flock to. And so you can really tell if what they really like is because you're going to find like almost a swarm or a ball of worms that is around that item. And so
Sure.
you're going to really tell what they like and then what they don't like. And so those are the things. And once you figure those pieces out, that really does help you kind of manage it. You're also going to be able to tell a lot about how they're functioning. And once you get into it and see how long does it take them to develop worm castings, how long does it take to get cocoons? How long are you finding baby worms? So there's a lot of these components that the more that you get in there and look at that piece, the more that you're going to know and really feel comfortable with your worm bed.
Lindsay, I got a question here. Should you let the coffee grounds and filters dry before you add them? I always added mine wet, and I never really had any problems with that.
I add mine wet because it's already going to get wet anyways. The bin itself needs to be moisture. If I forgot about it and left it in dried, I threw it in as well. So it really doesn't matter on that piece. The only thing I would be caution is to make sure that they're not piping hot.
Sure. Yep. That's a good point. Now, Lindsay, you were talking about using your compost tea out of the bottom of your bins. Do you cut that with water before you put that on your plants? To me, that would seem maybe it was a little acidic.
I've used it both ways. It depends on how far I need to make it stretch.
Okay.
Honestly, and what my plant looks like. I mean, I'm not as diverse in plant biology and plants as you are, so you might know better than I would.
I would like to collect some and do it and have a nutrient analysis on it, but we can talk about that later.
That's why we partner. I have the worms in the worm composting, and you figure out how to make it grow the pretty plants and vegetables that we all need.
Next, we're gonna talk about our smelly problems if our bin should become smelly.
So definitely, you can definitely overfeed a bin. And so again, we need to look at that. You need to really do kind of a study of how much food waste do you generate in your family. How big that will help play a factor on how big of a bin you need, how many worms, how many bins you need, a lot of those types of aspects. The other pieces is if you overfeed it, make sure that you just cut it back a little bit. So don't feed it for a couple of days. And if you live a busy life like myself, I go in wonderful spurts where I feed, and I overfeed, and then I forget about it for a while, and it works out just wonderful. And so it might be a month before I go back and feed my worms, and it's perfectly fine. But again, the other problem that creates odors is that you're not burying that food or covering the food. I definitely kind of nestle it into the worm, the compost or the soil, amended soil, I guess, if you want to call it that. I nestle it in there, and then I also cover it, and then I add that layer of paper or such. I don't add the paper every time just because I don't have a whole lot of extra paper or leaves. So that's why I kind of use the bedding that's already in there to cover it. I also have 3 bins that are in 3 different stages because they take, by the time I harvested one and I started that and then I start another one. So luckily I have mine that they last me all year round. I can harvest pretty much anytime I need, and they're all at different stages to help me. So that's why it's always best to also, once you get your first one under your belt, to try to start adding those extra ones.
All right, we're going to talk about low reproduction rate.
So this one goes back to how much do you know about your worms? So temperature, pH, moisture content. Is it too cold? The slower, the colder the temperature, and this is something especially in the winter time that you need to think about. Where is your worms living? Are they out in the garage or in the basement? Are they in the kitchen or a room off the kitchen, front porch? Where are they hiding at? And how does that temperature, the outside temperature, affect their bin? What does their temperature inside the bin look like? So the colder it is, obviously the slower that reproduction rate is, just as we are. When it's cold outside, we want to hibernate. We don't want to go out and do a lot of things. When it's warmer, we're all active. And so, same with the worms. If it's too high of a pH, it also equals the slower reproduction. If there's too much compost or waste in the bin. So I recently had this problem. I kind of lost track of one of my bins, and it was starting to almost fill completely up to the top. So I started to get some of that oxygen deprived lower layer, and then I also had too much castings in there, and so I started to see a reduction in my red worm population. So I just harvested it, and oh my gosh, it was almost night and day the difference of how that really made a difference in that pack. Because the too much, again, we talked about too much compost left in your bin can become toxic to the worms. They can't survive in their own poop. And so you're doing this for a reason, right? You're using the worms to not only get rid of your food waste, and so it's not going to the landfill, but I'm hoping that you're using it for the compost and the compost tea, and using that for a dollar value. I mean, enhancing your own soil amendment and natural fertilizers. So using it is huge. It also helped me to understand how many worms I had in my bin and a lot of those pieces. The cool thing about worms is that they will regulate their own selves. So yes, potentially you could, if in perfect conditions, you can have them reproducing quickly, but based on their food supply, a lot of these other conditions in the available space, they will definitely regulate themselves. And the more attention you get them, the more attention you give them, the faster your turnaround of compost is, and the more worms that you will actually have. The less attention, they will survive, but they will do it at a much slower rate. So other pieces of that is the size containers and the food supply. Escaping worms. So if you have escaping worms, then you have something wrong. They are seeking a new home or environment for some reason. So it's kind of going through your checklist. What is, look at the food, look at the bedding. Is it too wet? Same kind of those same things that we just talked about, but just looking into what you're doing. They can tolerate a little bit of the citric type of foods, but you have to watch it and make sure that it's only once here and there. The same with the eggs. You want to make sure that you rinse out that protein. They do need a little bit of the egg shells for calcium and to help with their food process or the food digestion process, but they can't just go hog wild on those eggshells. So it's just checking and seeing what might be off and becoming scientific investigators of helping them figure out why they're not liking their environment and how to get them to live back in there happy.
Some of that too might be, like Lindsay mentioned earlier, what are they gravitating towards? What do they seem to like more than they don't like? So if you notice that you're putting things in the bin and they're not eating them, that's probably something to avoid for that bin, yes, for that group of worms.
Pests is always the biggest challenge. One of the nuisance is the fruit flies. And unfortunately, once you get the fruit flies, it is a heck of a time trying to get rid of them. But the one thing is to make sure that you're always making sure to bury that food, or at least covering it. That is, if the fruit flies don't have anything to be attracted to, then they're not going to be able to, to land and actually reproduce and create more babies. And so they're all attracted to their own food source. And unfortunately, that's, rotten food. And so if you keep it buried and keep your bins in a productive piece of rate for your worms to really turn that food into compost and not letting it sit there, you can really, really reduce a lot of the pests that you're afraid of. And again, the next piece is making sure that you have the right worms for your bin. I found that various worm species have a lot to do with the flies. And so it's just making sure that you're getting the correct red wiggler worms.
Another insect that I found in my bins, they got in my bins at the office, and I did have to get rid of them because they were making everyone here angry at me. Fungus gnats.
Oh.
Fungus gnats are much smaller than fruit flies, and you can actually get them in your house plants. They'll live in the moist soil in the top of your house plants. So they like that moisture of my bin, and it didn't matter how much bedding I put in there, the fungus gnats were taking over my office. So I had to dump my bin, and I hung up fly tape to get rid of them. So that was another pest that I hadn't really had a problem with when I had them at my house. But this last time I had them here at the office, the fungus gnats were something that was a problem. So that's just something.
The other challenge I started having my worm bin, one of them here, the one that I take out to the schools, and it wasn't getting used enough. And so I did start developing a lot of those challenges. So it's one of those, you kind of have to be somewhat dedicated to your bin. You can abuse it for a little bit, but at some point of time, it really does need used and monitored. And so I ended up taking my bin at home, and it really, really made a difference, because you get some wet conditions in there, and it does start to create more challenges with those pests. If it's not used and it's just kind of sitting there dormant, it creates some challenges because it's all working. And so it's keeping it moving forward. You really do need to use the bin to reduce the chance of these pests settling in.
We're going to talk a little bit about harvesting. This is the same picture we showed before. In this bin on the top left, Lindsay kind of talked about how to harvest out of that. Your liquids drain to the bottom, and you've got this nice drain to harvest those and use those liquids for fertilizer. And as the worms eat out of these bins, they crawl up to the top to the next bin to keep eating. Someone did make a comment in the chat box that when you harvest these, there still may be some stragglers down here in the bottom. So you want to look out for those before you introduce it into your garden. In this type of bin, this is kind of the bin Lindsay was talking about. You feed in this corner, and then in this corner, and this corner, and you keep doing that around the bin. And then how I did it, I just harvested. When I thought it got to a point, I just took the soil out, and I laid it on a tarp, like down here in the left-hand corner. And worms don't like light. So you take a pinch of the soil off of the top of that pile, and you lay it aside, and the worms will just keep crawling to the bottom of that pile to get away from the light until you have them harvested. That's a little more labor-intense way to do it, and you can do it the same way in this bin. And then this is a homemade bin with the holes, which you could stack like this bin up here on the left, or you could harvest it like this wooden box bin and this bin here in the middle. There's many ways to harvest. Like I said, it just kind of depends on the bin that you use. The main thing to remember is that before the compost is incorporated into your garden, place it in the freezer for a week to make sure any worms that may still be in there are dead. Because remember, they can be invasive species, and we don't want to introduce those to our natural areas.
And you also want to keep a little bit of compost left in your box just to get the next bin started, or the next phase of the bin started.
Yes.
So you don't want to make sure that it's a clean, pristine environment afterwards. You want to make sure that you're leaving some of their natural environment in their home. Even if you are removing, most of it, you can maybe leave like a third of it in there, or, a little small portion of it just to make sure that they're going to seed back into the bin nicely.
Those are great points, Lindsay. In summary, we want to make sure that we're choosing the right location for our bin. We're choosing a bin that best suits our needs. You want to purchase the Yersinia fetida worms. Don't overfeed. We mentioned that a lot tonight. You don't want it too wet. You don't want it too hot. And freeze our compost before we use it. And now that you have turned your waste into a valuable resource,
make sure you use it.
That's right. We'll let Lindsay finish up here with some of her PR stuff for the recycling.
Well, thank you again for joining us tonight. It is our second workshop of 5, and so please remember that if you attended at least one more, or if this is your second one, you're now entered into our drawing to receive a compost system. We do have the various kinds of compost bins. So we have, this is as one of them is our vermicomposting, and then the next workshop we're going to do is backyard composting, and we have 2 types of backyard composters that we're going to be giving away. And in order to efficiently get the compost system out, you need to mark your calendar for August 18th. We're hoping that that can actually be an in-person bin, just because I have 9 bins and I am struggling for some space in my office. We're just trying to make sure that they do get to the winners that night. And so that, again, is August the 18th, but we're hoping that you'll be able to do that. In the meantime, we're working on a kind of a backside of this, of a research project to make sure that we're providing you the latest and updated information on all these types of bins. But this bin is our vermicomposting representative. You're going to get the Worm Hotel. It's actually a Worm 360, and you get worms plus the book, the Worms Eat My Garbage. It's kind of like a how-to guide, and it talks about a lot of different ways, and it's the kind of the go-to book. It is written by Mary Appenfeller, and it's kind of the go-to book for worm composting. So again, this bin, or the compost bins, part of this in the series of kind of the research part is also being sponsored and funded by the Morrow County Recycling Keep Morrow County Beautiful through a grant from our solid waste district, the Delaware Knox Marion Morrow Solid Waste District. So thanks to all of those pieces, and for you attending this workshop and our next workshop. Our information is on the screen here. You can always contact us or email us if you have any composting questions or need us to help in any way. Like I live the vermicomposting bin every day. I take it out to the classrooms. I've had it for, I don't know, I've been composting probably 6-8 years now for those pieces. Now I don't know everything, but at least I have some hands-on experience with that piece. And so we're more than happy to help you in any of those resources, or we can at least tap into our networks to help get you some answers of your questions. Yeah.
And this, like we mentioned at the beginning, this was recorded tonight. So if you want to go back and watch it, you can. It will be up on our website, morrow.osu.edu. And then Lindsay will have it on her recycling website as well that she has listed here. So if you have friends that missed it and they want to watch it, or if you missed something or you didn't get it written down, you can go back and rewatch it as well.
And our first compost workshop series is also on our website for your review, so that you can watch them all in order or go back and talk about, I need a refresher on what is those browns and greens or some of those other pieces. So you can always go back and look at that. Now, the next piece is that both of us are grant funded in many different ways. And so in order to keep our funders happy, we do need to have you pull out your phones and in your picture you can pull up your screen or your picture and hover it over the QR code, and it should allow you to go to our survey. If not, the survey will also be on our website for you to take. And we hope that you'll be able to. It's about 4 to 5 questions, and it does help us obtain some information that we need to get back to our grant funders and supporters. So it also helps us reach future funding, which is a huge piece, especially as we continue our environmental movement in Morrow County.
I think that's all we have for tonight. Again, we thank you for joining us, and we hope that you can join us again next month for our next class about backyard composting. Have a great week, and like Lindsay said, if you need us, we're here for you.
And I just want to say Happy Earth Week. All right, do you want to stop us, unrecord us?
Yeah, well, I didn't do that, but yeah, I will. And then you and I can chat.
Yeah.